welcome and thank you for joining us. We are here in Samui watching a lot of changes, watching the changes in the jungle, the changes in our own behaviors and minds. And then as we look at the world today, noticing that indeed there are still some currents of change happening. Just as we were getting used to being confined, people around the world are beginning to loosen some of the changes that were made. And so now there are new changes that are just disrupting all the habits we've acquired during the old changes. So we started thinking it might be a nice topic to talk about, how the process of change and the arising of habitual patterns or routines in response to our lives, how those routines are upset when change happens. And when you look at change, you really, with a mindfulness kind of practice, and you look at what change is all about, it really is the process of the gunas acting on the gunas, where there is a state, and then the state might perhaps be tamasic, sort of dull and not much happening, or steady and sort of still and not engaged. And then that process gets booted into action by something, usually, and that is when the rajasic sort of guna comes on the scene and boots the tamasic pattern into action. And then those two synthesize and a state of sattva happens. So in the changes we've seen where there was lockdown, we were all panicked. That was a sort of rajasic thing that happened. And then
kind of tamasic in that you were
demanding tamas.
And
then we all got so nice and comfortable in this state of lockdown. And for a while, there was some potential sattva, but there was also a lot of unease and dis-ease and concern and anxiety. And so the sattvic feeling never really sank in. And now, again, more changes are happening. So what we recognize when we look at this process from the perspective of a mindfulness practice is that this is going on around us all the time, whether it's in our minds, whether it's in the world as a whole, whether it's in our garden or in our case in the jungle, and we watch, incredible changes overnight to plants or animals that are insects that come in one night having been born, and that's it for them one day. And so this process is ongoing all the time. And we find ourselves in a state of being in this sea or this current of change and infinite change. But also within that process of change, there is the potential for stability as well as insight. And when we apply the mindfulness practice to our own state of being within the process of change or just within the process of being, we recognize that it too is a pattern, a wave pattern, just in a way like so many of the other aspects of being and of life that we encounter. We can start recognizing what is it that actually sort of defines our state of being, and the way to really look closely at that is to bring mindful awareness, attention to the process of being. That things, and we talk about them in mindfulness practice as they are the 5 empty heaps.
Oh, yeah. So there's a great thing that everyone should memorize. In fact, that's your homework now. It's quite well known. It's called the Heart Sutra. And if you don't understand it completely, that's actually a good sign when you first read it. Anyway, in it, Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, of great compassion, looks down, and they say he looks down from above and he sees but 5 empty heaps, or panchaskanda. And another term you'll find in many texts that are not Buddhist, but also in Buddhist, is ghana. And so a skanda or ghana just means a pile, or just like a trash pile, or one of my favorite is like a pile of salt. Because if you have a pile of salt, if you taste it, on the corner, it tastes just like salt. If you dig really deep into it and find the innermost grain, it's still just some salt. And so it's basically a heap, which has no particular order, and any point in the heap is just same as all the other points. And so it's considered a pile. And he saw but 5 piles, and that's all there is to see or experience anywhere, is these 5 piles. And they're very interesting, and the parallels to the Yoga Sutra are just
pretty amazing.
Pretty amazing. It's like, who's reading whom here? But the first pile is called rupa, and there's a special sense. Rupa just means form in general, but in the sense of the Yoga Sutra, rupa means that aspect of experience that we all share, like the earth, like nature, like the environment, history, all of these things that if I'm not paying attention to it, that doesn't really matter. It's not going away. It's probably more my little embodiment that's going away. And so that which we share, like the environment, is considered to be that kind of form. And that's the first heap. And when he saw that, and he was looking, and he noticed that if you look really closely at form, or that which we share, that it is shunyata, it is empty of swabhava, or self-form. And then he was noticing that form is emptiness, which we immediately bow down to. Oh, emptiness is the answer to everything. And we're saying, no, emptiness is form, and form is emptiness. There's no difference between. You couldn't find that, because there's swabhava shunyam, meaning empty of any kind of separate self. Okay. And so, so already you should be going, what are you talking about, Avalokiteshvara? Okay. And then he says, but the same is true of Vedana, which means sensation or touch, in the sense of prana in the Yoga Sutra, or that which is, so we initially think of sensation as, touch throughout the body, or patterns of touch throughout the body, but also it refers to sensation as sound, or as sight, or taste, or smell. And so sensations, normally we translate as the different pranas, or they are also shunyata, empty of any swabhava, or self-form, any independent. If you look really closely at them, there's nothing you can find that is separate or distinct from their entire background, which is everything else. It's like, and so we would say, oh, it is empty. But that emptiness, that Vedana, that pure sensation, is emptiness, and the emptiness is the pure sensation. It's not like a dualistic thing at all. Like, you're never going to find shunyata empty. And then, well, what's the next one? Oh, and this follows this chain of flow of how things arise in our minds. Sangya is the next empty heap. And Sangya is, we all experience this, when you have those rare moments where you're just going, to be, what do you say? You just go, and you're just experiencing sensation, and all of a sudden the mind tags it, puts it into a category, nama,
puts a label on it.
Puts a little label, and it's not necessarily, usually not a linguistic label, where you go, aha, that is a frog biting my toe or something. But it's just like a recognizing of it, and it doesn't have to be on the verbal kind of language thing. It's kind of more like an embodiment language. But as soon as it's tagged, then you're paying attention to the tag and no longer to the sensation.
And if you look very closely, you realize that in a meditation practice that it is the tag that makes it, and your interference in the flow of this process of being by putting that tag on, that pulls it out of its background. And
that makes you no longer pay attention
right.
to this internal breath, to sensation. But don't worry, because all of the sangya is swabhava shunyam. It is emptiness itself, and emptiness is the sangya. So no one there to worry about, huh? Okay. And then what happens is a big one that you don't experience directly, but somehow we understand it, and it's called samskara. And samskara is the habitual and we believe embodied or placed into whatever type of body you have. Samskara is kind of the collection and the habit of mind. And
it's triggered by
the
process
tag.
of naming, by the process of
The tag. As soon as it's tagged, then all of a sudden that activates something. And I think metaphorically and perhaps actually, it activates something, that's below our conscious awareness. And then, boom, a chitta vritti comes up. And of course, this is the basis of yoga, that you have samskara, and then vritti is what appears. And then the vritti reinforces the samskara and adds to it. Maybe, it's like a piling up of, and then more vritti, more samskara, more vritti. And so the final heap after the samskara is called vijnana, and this means specific intellectual activity or intelligence. A kind of wisdom, but it has to do with functional wisdom. So it's the possibility, everyday awareness of things. Our favorite story, our favorite drama, or whether exciting or boring or good or bad. And so the vijnana skandha is completely empty of any separate self. There's no, if you look really, really closely at that, you won't find anything or anybody. It's like this. It's all connected to everything else. So it is emptiness, and emptiness is it.
And what happens is there, believe it or not, can be confusion that arises in this process of
Sometimes.
observing these 5 empty heaps, because within the process of being unfolding in this way, the process of experience unfolding, there is this tendency to want to know and to want to check out of the discomfort that we feel when we think, well, you know, if everything is empty of self-form, if everything doesn't really, is all interpenetrating, how do we navigate in this process? And so what we want to talk about a little bit today is the process of how samskaras arise and how they influence our behaviors as well as our mind states, and how we can sort of look at them in the bigger context. One of the things that seems really important to remember, if we're thinking back to the beginning of this talk where we were talking about change as a process also, so you have this process of change happening, and in the process of change, form arises. So rupa, the first thing, you know, presents itself in some way into your steady state of mind. And in that process, you know, then the process of tamas, rajas, and sattva is going on whether or not you interact with it or manipulate it.
Yeah.
And what happens when we can relax into the concept and the actual embodied feeling of mental perception and embodied perception of this idea of 5 heaps that cause being to happen, is that we can see the merging of change and the interpenetration of change with the process of samskaras arising.
Yeah.
And with that ability to see that interpenetration, we can then possibly pause long enough to step back and not immediately identify with the mind state that might arise due to the samskara or due to the process that we're experiencing.
Yeah. I can't resist making, this is totally a footnote, okay, and that's a joke, by the way, foot meaning foot, meaning rupa, okay, ground. But the process of inquiring into the panchaskandha, or the 5 heaps, is part of the 5 heaps. There's nothing that manifests, and even my wanting to understand or not wanting to understand, these are also empty, they are shunyata also, which doesn't allow you, even if you form a conclusion from that, that conclusion is also empty of self-form. And that's why occasionally you just it's kind of like it's delightful. I think that's the thing. But I think what we were talking about is what's very fascinating that I come up with a lot these days, you know, considering the greater predicament that not only I'm in, but all of the beings I run into, particularly human beings all around the planet, is this idea of samskara, which are our deep, deep ingrained habits, and how those are activated, and you were usually completely oblivious to their activation. And then we can end up, you know, off on some story, oftentimes not a happy story, sometimes, you know, like, oh, woe is me, and for possibly, you know, very legitimate reasons. Or we react to it and we all of a sudden, I got to get back to work. And so the story activates, you know, kind of lust or greed or need.
And we often, within our own practices, observe this as well as talk about it with students and see this too, that samskaras really are embodied. They are, and Richard, you often talk about them as, it's almost like they're layered. They're layers that are stuck together, layers of misperceptions, so that when we go into a yoga practice sometimes, and this is something that has been happening to people these days, but also I remember vividly when 9/11 happened as well, as sort of another horrific thing that happened. People would come to yoga class and it was very difficult for people to practice. So in a time like this with change where routines are upset, where, it's tedious and annoying to even think of 5 empty heaps. I just want to get down to it and do what needs to happen to move on and make things stable again. That it can be very, very difficult to do an asana practice. And with 9/11, and also in this time when there is such incredible suffering in this world, where you may not know someone personally who has died or know someone who's known someone who's died, though many of us do know people who've had the virus or who have died from the virus. But there is this palpable feeling of suffering when you think about the fact that people all over the world right now, there are people who cannot breathe. There are people who are not with their loved ones on their deathbed. And there's this background uneasy feeling. No matter how joyful you might feel about something else, there's this background feeling of suffering that is happening. And so when we go to practice sometimes, and especially doing back bends where we are in a very, very vulnerable position, it can feel too much, or you might notice yourself doing a back bend and then having a wave of emotion arise, or even bursting into tears. That happens sometimes in yoga practice. And after 9/11, it was almost impossible for students to do back bends. And part of what we see that as is this fact that when we are so vividly moved by something like an event like the coronavirus, that's an ongoing process that we're dealing with, the samskaric patterns that we've built up within our own embodied experience that are protecting us, that are often misperceptions where things are that really are not related, are glued together, almost like the fascia is connected to the muscle and stuck to the muscle in ways, and then we do a back bend and rip apart the samskara in a sense. And so whatever we might have been holding in there is then revealed, and it can be a time of great transformation, but it can also be a time where it's too much. So you can, you don't have to always peel the samskaras out of your nervous system by doing the, okay kid, here's a Band-Aid on your knee, let's pull it off now. You can just eke it off with a little bit of water over the course of a month, and slowly open up these samskaras within the body, where we hold these beliefs and perceptions that may morph into misperceptions.
And it's really important to know that samskaras, as we learned, are empty of self-form. They are shunyata, and shunyata is samskara. That they're not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, they can be extremely useful to have some samskaras. And I think, as humans, a lot of our natural behavior is samskara. And so there are samskaras that are extremely useful biologically, that you wouldn't survive for 2 minutes without. And then there are positive samskaras that you don't want to necessarily get rid of, because those are samskaras that allow you to experience others, that allow you to actually become grounded. And so it often takes a positive samskara in order to suspend the reaction to negative samskaras. So negative samskara would be, of course, anger, or extreme greed, or extreme need, or fear,
or pain. And so,
yeah.
An example that I love, that I often talk about, is that the way Thich Nhat Hanh talks about positive, negative, and neutral samskaras. That we, for the most part, most samskaras are neutral. They are, just relatively neutral. Then there are the positive ones that, we might want to water those seeds for the positive samskaras. But then there are the negative samskaras. And the example he gives is that a negative samskara would be pain, or he says, or it would be a toothache. If you have a toothache, that would be a negative samskara. And if you realize that, in fact, there are far fewer negative samskaras than there are neutral samskaras, and actually far fewer positive than there are neutral. But if you want to sort of pad your bank account with positive samskaras, you can at least temporarily get yourself out of a mind state that's trapped by the storyline associated with, say, a toothache or pain in your SI joint or something like that, by focusing on something that is positive. So the example he gives is that a neutral samskara would be a non-toothache. Or for me, I have a certain amount of chronic pain, and so sometimes I am in excruciating pain, and I think, well, are my lips painful? And in fact, so far, they haven't ever been painful in that way. And so in the midst of something really horrible, if I can just shift my mindset momentarily to really feeling the sensation, which is where the samskara arises from, of non-pain, then I have this capacity to start shifting and watering seeds of positive samskaras, rather than watering the seeds of suffering and negative habitual patterns or samskaric.
Right. So when there's, say, something that is physically miserable, and then when you stop doing it, it's like, But what I've noticed is that doesn't last for very long.
No, it doesn't, unfortunately.
It's like when you do certain back bends and you come out of them and you're going, so nice. And you're just completely wonderful. And then 4 or 5 seconds later, you've moved on, or you've become attached. The ego has jumped in, and it's taken that temporarily very positive samskara, that experience of, it's all nice, and then it's trying to package it. Maybe I can sell this, make profit from it, and then it becomes transformed by the ego, or the ego function, into a dangerous, eventually a negative samskara. So basically the idea in yoga is that when something arises, like a chitta vritti, which is that means anything that's arising in your awareness, if you're really watching closely, what the mind or the intelligence automatically does is called pratipaksha kriya, or it creates like an envelope of context for it, so that it's no longer seen as a separate self, but it is seen as a function. And then that suspends reacting to it. Okay, so I might, have a discomfort in my body when I sit to practice, and a discomfort that normally, would make me grumpy. And then I would start to think, oh, this reminds me of what I read in the news the other day, and I would, take off on a 30-minute rant about global politics or something. This is all theoretical, of course.
Yeah,
I
right.
would never do that. But if I'm actually practicing, in those rare moments, those same sensations arise, but there's an interest, not necessarily an intellectual interest, but a fascination with the sensation that creates in the body a kind of a metaphorical envelope for it. And so the mind no longer has to go off on the trip. So the samskara doesn't stimulate the sangya, the label, the initial labeling of the sensation pattern doesn't stimulate this habitual story. Mm-hmm. And so you're not feeding the samskara. And then they say it's almost like then the samskara slowly dies away, or it's starved. And then you start to get a taste of what's called nirodha, or suspension. And the nirodha samskara is this taste of that which is too nice to even to try to describe, the taste of emptiness. If emptiness has a taste, okay. And so that experience, that forms a nirodha samskara. But it's still, eventually, as time goes on, that nirodha samskara I will associate through the same process with the history of it. Oh, when I think about, this, then I start to feel good. And my ego will sometimes co-opt that. And I'll turn a positive samskara, nirodha samskara. Eventually, I have to see it, see through it. And so that the ego doesn't co-opt and try to create a separate religious self within it or make it special. So eventually I have to give up even the positive, the wonderful nirodha samskaras. And so this is true, I think, of religious things in which we empower, say, a mantra, or in my own mind, oh, the sound of that bird, and normally when I hear that sound, I go, and I feel like, oh, nature is good, and have all of these things. And trust me, my mind will turn that, what is a wonderful thing, but it'll eventually try to exploit that, and perhaps even market it after I patent it.
And so we become, we have the potential to use this process of the samskaras arising in a positive way, whether they're positive, negative, or neutral. And we also, and in the way we might do that is to maintain mindfulness practice. In other words, be attentive to the process of the samskara forming and arising, and whether it's an old, habitual pattern or a brand new kind of pattern that we're forming, the more quickly we can come into this process of applying a mindful attentiveness to witness, to almost bear witness to whatever the samskara is, then we can work with it and meet it and allow it to transmute or to surface. As we pointed out, there are many samskaras that are very, very helpful. They allow us to not have to think about jumping out of the way of a bus as the bus comes flying down the street towards us.
It can be useful.
Yeah, it can be very, very useful. But especially in times of stress and anxiety and fear or anger, one of the things that happens is we start avoidance mechanisms or techniques that we have cultivated consciously or unconsciously over however many years, so that by that I mean things like we may find that, you know, anxiety is arising. We notice these, you know, patterns of responding to it that we could call habitual patterns, and then we just go and have a drink, or we go and do a really incredibly hard yoga practice to blow the thought out of our mind, or we take external substances to try to shift and deaden the experience. And one thing that's particularly distressing to me is this idea of that there are external influences that come into play that can throw us off track, and actually, rather than allowing samskaras to sort of arise and blossom, and we allow us to feed the good ones and not feed the less good ones, the external factors or influences.
I mean, things that are coming from the quote-unquote real,
from the
the rupa world,
the rupa,
where
which could
there's
be things,
historical,
yeah,
there are other people, and
and it could be things
situations.
like, you know, like things like drugs or alcohol that we deaden the experience with, or it could be the propaganda of other people, or the ideas of other people that then shift us into a state of more rigidity within our own mind states, and attachment to our samskara.
That makes you more fearful, more proud, more superior, more separate.
And totally incapable of imagining that, you know, things
Propaganda.
are empty of self-form, that things are all interpenetrating. And one word that I was talking to Richard about this earlier that I find really disturbing. There's some languaging around social media and current marketing ideas, is this idea of influencers, where they are people who, you know, have fame or something on a lot of followers, let's say, and they are taken by others, used to kind of influence behaviors and influence the sort of shoring up of certain samskaric behaviors of other people. In a way, they could be good, the people might be good, whoever this influencer is, but it is a way of inviting us to check out and to not be present with what is actually arising. And we've been thinking about, you know, the fact that how important it is, especially in this time of change and chaos and crisis, to find the roots of truth rather than to give in to the roots of storyline, which can quickly come and transform into our own ideas that are almost self-propaganda, our rigid ideas that, you know, I am this, that, or the other. I can think of an example at the moment.
Oh, I am special.
Yeah. Or I am a failure.
Or I am superior.
Yeah.
And or I am a failure.
Terrified.
Yeah, or I'm any of these ego stories. And then I was just thinking that you could have positive influencers. In other words, you know, if you can help people via the communication of sattvic ideas that are self-dissolving, that just will leave people with the ability to look deeply at their own experience without, the illusion of a separate self.
And I think we
That would be a
talked
positive
last
thing.
time
Yeah.
about, being able to imagine people who are punya,
Yeah.
and they would be positive influencers. But by labeling people as influencers, there is an inherent danger in those people thinking, oh, I've been labeled an influencer, therefore I'm special, and instead of becoming more and more punya or enlightened or compassionate,
kind.
they become more and more separate and manipulative.
They
maybe
enjoy.
not even purposely. So, and it's this really delicate territory we find ourselves in these days, where we are, where we are all treading on loose sand and not really sure where we're headed or what's going to happen. And so the urge is to either have someone else, like a person who's, like, I always think of the Dalai Lama as a punya, person who is punya, someone who really inspires me, or someone who has, 5 million followers on whatever it is that's in these days. I guess they're, an influencer too. But, our tendency is to stop, even if you are in the presence of someone very, very profound,
Mm-hmm.
like the Dalai Lama, it is really important to stay awake and to process your own experience with intelligence.
Yeah, to actually practice.
To practice, yeah.
Yeah. That reminds me of there's something I found in the Yoga Sutra. Oh, just happens to pop up right here. And it's in the second pada when they're describing the Ashto Angani, the 8 limbs. And we have just talked about the yamas and the niyamas. And as we all know, the first of the yamas is ahimsa, which is basically non-violence or not hurting. And you could spin that positively as kindness. And then all of the others, all the way to the santosha, socha, santosha of the niyamas, tapas, svadvaya, ishvara, prani, dhanani, niyama. And then, interestingly enough, the next 3 verses bring in something really fascinating. And verse 33, vitarka bhadane pratipaksha bhavanam. So in the sense now, the term vitarka, which is sometimes a term that's just used for dialectical discussion, but for a lot of people, dialectics means argument. Okay, it's not like we're really interested. It just means we want to fight. Okay, and they're willing to kill people for some theory they have, some metaphysical theory. I'll chop your head off. Okay, it's this craziness. Okay, so in this vitarka, badhane can be made by pratipaksha bhavanam, or by the contemplation of the opposite wing. And so the great metaphor is, a bird, if has an injured wing, it doesn't fly very well with one wing. I've watched that in the last few days, of birds. But 2 wings, somehow it seems to work out. And so this is the tarka, the vitarka, this is the proposition, and this is the antithesis of it. They're interdependent. The antithesis is unconscious in our minds, like I might make the proposition, I am great. And then my intelligence, which is more interwoven with the body, goes, it probably has a little more information. And so the counter proposition, not so great. Both of those allow one to fly. Okay. So if you cultivate the pratipaksha kriya with negative states,
in other words, contemplate the opposite state.
yeah, unwholesome thoughts. So occasionally, even these days, not that, remember, you're not your thoughts. So in everyone, unwholesome thoughts arise, like I just want to I won't even tell you. You can come up with your own unwholesome thoughts. Okay. But the next verse gives you a few examples. Okay. Vitarka himsadaya krita karita anubodita. So, and I'll just read you this nice translation. We ourselves may act upon unwholesome thoughts, which are vitarka, such as wanting to harm someone, okay, or we may cause or condone them in others. Okay, so if I want to harm, say, someone I think is, of course, harming other people, okay, and so I might heroically, I think, well, it would be nice for all beings if this one being would stop being harmful, okay? And that might be very true. But then what happens is I then lose my insight as to why I wanted to help others, but I just see, oh, that's the correct thing, and then I grab it like that. And then I think, well, I can't harm them, but I sure hope somebody else harms them, or if somebody, and so I am really obsessed with that. And this is not my actual story, I'm just saying theoretically, of course. Okay. And so even if I approve of it, it's like, then that's going to be embodied in my subtle body.
And
it's going to be embodied as samskara.
A samskaric embodiment.
Yeah, and a tough samskara. They're painful. Okay. We may cause them or condone others, and so these same thoughts may arise from greed, anger, or delusion. Okay, and so greed meaning it's almost the positive sense. I need to start making some money, and that's natural. But then money then becomes, you forget why you want the money, and you just want money. Okay, so you just start seeing everything in terms of money or profit. Or anger, or even delusion. And delusion could be because I'm so afraid of the obvious truth of impermanence that is happening in the world around me, I clasp onto crazy theories like the flat earth theory or conspiracy theories that, if you actually think about them, don't make any sense and logically would require so much more than just the infinite mystery of nature unfolding. And so I'm deluded. So, and they can be mild, moderate, or extreme. And so the examples I'm giving or I'm thinking of are extreme, but mild are something you might just experience in your household. Same kind of thing. It could be, a whole thing with a gecko, which we like a lot, or it could be with, one of your neighbors who,
has a light that shines
has a light
in your
that
eyes.
shines in your eyes in the middle of the night, and then and it'll actually trigger, all of this stuff. And the nice thing about the yoga practice is you start to notice, like, here I am, good me, just sitting here meditating, and I'm just going, and it's over like it could be very local and trivial, or it could be, interplanetary problems. But all of them, they never cease to ripen. They're always ripening into ignorance and suffering.
So meaning
Yeah.
separateness.
Yeah, Agyana, ananta pala. So they ripen as a fruit of agyana or ignorance, and it's ananta or endless ignorance and dukkha. Iti pratipaksha bhavanam. Therefore, contemplate the opposite wing. Okay, and so even it doesn't have to be a sophisticated meditation. You can sit down intellectually and contemplate the logical consequences of, forming an extremist group that has to kill off this other extremist group that rose because they were trying to kill off some other extremist group. And you start, you can think about it historically, you think about it practically, think about it environmentally.
The situation you may be in now, where we are facing, we have weathered some changes, we're facing new changes, and there is this sort of feeling of find your footing. And so things arise that are distressing, or they cause you fear or anger or detachment from others, or for that you really love the people who you're surrounded by, because they have that irritating habit of chewing their food just wrong. And so that kind of thing is where we can really, at this point in our storylines, take the opportunity and make the opportunity to practice observing the process of that happening within yourself, and then possibly, reframing it. That would be a sort of psychological term for the two wings, looking for something to reframe whatever it is that might be causing fear or anxiety or distress. And rather than going with that storyline, with the samsaric embodied patterns that arise, just pausing, observing, and bringing a mindfulness practice off the cushion, into the living room and the kitchen and wherever you happen to be.
Yeah. Small scale or big scale or medium scale, what they call it. But the next verse is what I thought, this is very clever. Ahimsa prashishtayam tat sanidho vairatyaga. Okay, and so becoming grounded, firmly grounded in ahimsa, creates an atmosphere in which others can let go of their hostility. Okay, and because a lot, the samskaras and the stories that really upset the prana usually have to do with relationship, even if they're imaginary relationships. So, all of these imaginary creatures in the forest laugh at me, but that'll keep you awake at night. Okay, but much more powerful. There's actual beings that you either want something from them, and so they're not actually being held in the heart. Of course, therefore, your pranayama is very difficult. And so the practice of ahimsa, which is kindness, is what's going to allow the transformation, because it allows dialogue. And dialogue is a very rare thing, even in the modern world, because argument is not rare, but where people actually sit down with, say, the competing school, or the competing politicians or something, it's very rare. But they actually sit down because they recognize, finally, they've had a little glimpse of each other, that we're really the same, in slightly different, and they start to actually communicate. wow, the potential is just amazing. And this has happened historically. That's when, these different schools of yoga have actually evolved. It's when they've actually communicated. It's usually in the alleys between the ashrams, or between the hermitages, or between, one valley and another. The few yoginis, they actually talk to each other and they go, hey, and they discover that, wow, you're saying the same thing with a different language. And then there's the insight into the
And you can do
emptiness.
that even within your own mind, with your own, disparate thoughts, where you're
your own multiple personalities.
Yeah, multiple personalities, which show up a lot when we're isolated, and so that you don't fall into habitual patterns of behavior. You may have habitual thoughts that arise, but when you pause long enough and allow dialogue to happen within this process, then you have the opportunity for transformation, which is part of what happens when there is a merging with the 5 empty heaps and change, where transformation happens rather than forcing your way or taking someone else's stance. It is a possibility for transformation, which at this point in our collective history, there is this sort of yearning to just let's get back to normal, or this is going to be the new normal. But rather than making theories about what the new normal is, if we can wake up and stay in dialogue with one another and with ourselves, and watch these processes unfolding, the process of change, the process of being, watch them unfolding and interpenetrating, and realize that this is a great time of opportunity to take hold and decide what habitual patterns, what samskars weren't serving the world, or weren't serving you or your loved ones, and then not automatically falling back into them. So taking time to be really careful with how we allow these habitual urges to manifest and transform. You could just chill.
Yeah. So you have your homework, or
Heart Sutra.
homework, yeah. Memorize the Heart Sutra and the Yoga Sutra, and then do a comparative analysis of. So we'll finish with a chant. This is the Shantipat of Yajurveda, and it's particularly interesting because it doesn't lay down any metaphysical belief, but it's simply pointing out the fact of codependent arising, in a sense. That everything is saha. Everything comes up together, like we come up together. So, first line, sahana bhavatu, may we be protected together, all of us. Because if I get protected but you're not, okay, eventually you'll rise up and throw me off my throne, and okay, it's happened. And then sahana bonaktu, may we together enjoy or even eat. Okay, and again, that's looking at our interdependence. Sahaviryam karabhavahe, may our work together, this is easier said than done, may our work together be filled with virya, or courage. So you may you have enough intuitive sense of the delight of the other beings that you can actually work together with courage. because you can get a lot more done if you work together, particularly if it involves technology. Tejasvinavati tam astu. May our study together. So we're going to study, and we're going to look into all of these topics, which seem to be infinite in all directions. But we're going to look at them together, because you can get a lot more information than trying to invent things. Just like if you've ever been to a library, you realize that all of that stuff, all that information, is from thousands, hundreds, millions of other people working and synthesizing for a long time. And so may our study together be filled with great tejas, or brilliance, and the last line, ma vidvishavahai, and may we not hate each other. Okay, which is the result of the problem. So when you first try to do things together with other beings, the initial okay, and of course that is part of the process of transformation of the 5 empty heaps. So don't worry about it, it's natural. Okay. So rather than starting with Om, which is traditional, so when chanting, when you say Om at the beginning, you're setting the key in which you're chanting. Okay, so that's the mid-tone of the chant. But in order to not be at all sectarian, I'm just going to make the humming sound of Om. It's so you won't even be able to tell, and that'll set the key. Okay, it's hard not to do the. Okay. Sahana bhavatu, sahana bhunaktu, sahaviryam karavavahai, tejasvinavaditamastu, ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Sahana bhavatu, sagana bhunaktu, sahaviryam karavavahai, tejasvinavaditamastu, ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.